Our Old Testament reading this morning is Deuteronomy 30:15-20. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways and observing his commandments, decrees and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and holding fast to him, for that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. This is the word of the Lord.
Life and death. This is the choice that Moses places in front of the Hebrew people in our text today. And it seems a little melodramatic, doesn't it? Yet, the book of Deuteronomy is presented as Moses' last going away sermon. These are the last words of a dying man to the community he loves right before they enter the promised land. And at 34 chapters, it's some sermon. So show a guy a little gratitude this morning, won't you? And Moses has already spent the first few hours of his sermon telling them exactly what choosing the way of God looks like. And it may not be what we think. Deuteronomy is one of the 5 books of the law. And in our Christian tradition, Paul has shaped the way that we view the Old Testament law, probably even more than the Old Testament law itself. Maybe you, like me, tend to think of the law as an impossible burden, as a tedious list of do's and don'ts that no human being could ever live up to. And over time, the law does expand into that, as rabbis who are attempting to make the laws more understandable add extra laws to clarify the ambiguous ones. And in Jesus' day and in Paul's day, these clarifications and expansions are viewed just as authoritatively as what we read in the Bible itself. And it all falls under the umbrella of what Paul means when he speaks of the law. But I challenge you to read through Deuteronomy for yourselves, because you may be surprised by what you find. For one thing, it's all too doable. For another thing, we don't see nearly as much on the subject of personal piety as one expects. The real meat of what we find here is how we are to live and care for one another. Later, when Jesus teaches us the great commandment, he'll instruct us that loving God and loving our neighbor are one in the same thing. We show our love to the God that we cannot touch and see by loving the neighbor that we can. But Jesus didn't pluck this idea out of the sky. He interpreted it from his Bible. It's right here in Deuteronomy. And even though it's doable, it certainly isn't easy. In chapter 6, it tells us to love God with all of our heart, mind, and strength. Sound familiar? Well, how is that done? Deuteronomy chapter 10 instructs one to love the foreigner, because you were foreigners in Egypt not that long ago. Chapter 15, cancel the debts of the poor. 16 pushes government to guard against excessive wealth. 19 limits punishments to protect human dignity. 20 restricts those who can be drafted. Chapter 23, show hospitality to runaway slaves. 24 requires fair pay for all employees, and part of the harvest to be left out in the field for the poor who need it. Are you surprised? I was. I am. I learned that I spend too much time quoting the Bible to serve my own agenda and not nearly enough time reading it. And I'm not the only one. These are the tangible commands that Moses gives the community in order for them to be faithful to their intangible God. And worship is a part of it, but the heart of the commands are about how we care for others. And here in the church, we can sometimes get those backwards. Moses' sermon builds to our text today. Having set before the Hebrew people the demands of their covenant with God, Moses challenges them to choose. They can choose their own self-interests, or they can choose the way of God, the way of life. And the ironic thing about their choice is that obeying their own self-interests isn't really in their best interest at all. It will be better for them if they choose the way of God and care for others, even with all of its risks. And this is true for communities and individuals. And we all must choose. In my high school years, I got into some of the troubles that many teenage boys get into. I even got into fights and was proud of it, frankly. Now I don't want to give you the wrong idea or play it up too much like some of those good old Baptist testimonies. I really wasn't that bad a kid. Looking back, I was doing what so many teens do. I was searching for life, purpose, and meaning in the wrong places. And it led me into some dangerous situations. One day I got a call from a man that I had come to know through some of these poor decisions. And this wasn't another high schooler. This was a grown man, and he threatened to kill me. And I prided myself on being tough and on not backing down from a fight. But this guy didn't want to fight me. He was going to shoot me. And I was scared. I was with a friend when I got the call. And afterward, my friend and I talked through all kinds of options for how to deal with this situation. And ultimately, my friend looked at me and told me something that in my being I knew to be true. He said, "Jake, you have to get right with God." And I'm not sure whether he meant that God was my only hope for getting out of this situation, or that there was no hope for getting out of this situation, and I needed to make peace with God. I'm still not sure what he meant. Either way, for the first time in my life, I got on my knees and I prayed, "Lord, I know enough about you to know that I'm not supposed to test you. But if you make this go away, then I'll serve you with the rest of my life." A week later, I sat alone watching friends play a summer league baseball game, and I glanced over. And there, sitting with a single seat empty in between us, was that man. And terror overcame me. And I felt sure that my life was over, and I waited for the hammer to fall. But nothing happened. He never even acknowledged me. At the time, I took that as an answer to my prayers. And then I went home. And for the second time in my life, I got on my knees to pray. Lord, I don't know what you did, or even if you did anything. Maybe he was too high to remember the call he made the other day. Maybe he was too high today to recognize me. But somehow you lived up to your end of the deal, and I'm going to try to live up to mine. And I used to think that that was the miracle in the story, but I don't think that anymore. That's classic bargaining stage of grief. One thinks themselves or a loved one is going to die, so you make a deal with God. And that's as human as it gets. Many people do that all of the time. And I don't believe that God arbitrarily chose me to live and another person making that same bargain in their fight against cancer or some other illness to die. I don't know why those things happen, but I don't think that's God. No, the miracle, the real miracle in that story, in my story, is what happens next. And I began to go to church and pay attention. I started reading my Bible, and I really gave myself to try to be like this Jesus guy. And I certainly wasn't very good at it. But somehow in trying, even in trying and failing, I was being transformed. I clearly remember one event in particular. I was in conflict with another student at school, and the way that I had learned to resolve this kind of conflict was to fight. We were in that pre-fight stage of bowing up and puffing our chests out when I had a moment of clarity. Awakening, maybe. I remembered that Jesus said to love our enemies. And I knew that's what I had to try to do. So I stopped and I apologized. And I walked away. And this is the miracle in the story. Walking away, I experienced a bigger dose of what I had been getting in smaller doses ever since I committed to trying to be like this Jesus guy. It was life. This was the life that I had been searching for, and it felt wonderful. I liked who I was in this moment more than I ever did before. The Bible tempts us to taste and see that the Lord is good, and that is exactly what was happening, and it was and still is delicious. And I had no idea that there was another way to live, but this new way gave me such purpose and meaning that the old way, well, it wasn't really life at all in comparison. And it's the same thing that happens to all of us when we choose to step inside God's abundant life here in this world. It is a gift we receive. It is a choice we must make and keep making. And God doesn't punish or curse us for choosing to walk outside of covenant or by a different way of life than Jesus. No, living outside of covenant is itself a curse, both to us and those around us. Our true selves, that part of us that was created to live for something bigger than ourselves, will surely wither and die. And at the same time, living the way God desires, illustrated most clearly in the life of Jesus, blesses itself and those around us. It honors who we are created to be and gives us true life. Life overflowing, and everyone around us gets splashed. God's commandments and ways are not meant as restrictions or even as a way to gain God's favor, but rather as prescriptions that lead us to fullness of life for all, personally and communally. In his book, The Ragamuffin Gospel, Brennan Manning tells a delightful story about Fiorello LaGuardia, who, when he was the mayor of New York City during the worst days of the Great Depression and all of World War II, was called the Little Flower by adoring New Yorkers because he wore a carnation on his lapel and he stood at only 5'4". He was a colorful character who used to ride the New York City fire trucks, raid speakeasies with the police department. He would take entire orphanages to baseball games. And whenever the New York newspapers were on strike, he would go on the radio and read the funnies to the kids. Well, one bitterly cold night in January of 1935, the mayor turned up at a night court, one that served the poorest ward in the city. LaGuardia dismissed the judge and took over the bench himself for the evening. And within a few minutes, a tattered old woman was brought before him, charged with stealing a loaf of bread. She told LaGuardia that her daughter's husband had deserted her. Her daughter was sick, and her 2 grandchildren were starving. But the shopkeeper, from whom the bread was stolen, refused to drop the charges. "It's a bad neighborhood, Your Honor," the man told the mayor. "She's got to be punished to teach other people around here a lesson." LaGuardia sighed. He turned to the woman and said, "I've got to punish you. The law makes no exceptions. 10 days or $10. But even as he pronounced the sentence, the mayor was already reaching into his pocket, pulling out his billfold, and taking a $10 bill out and threw it in his big hat. He extracted a bill, tossed it in his hat, and says, "Here is the $10 fine which I now remit. And furthermore, I'm going to fine every one of you in this courtroom 50 cents for living in a town where a person has to steal bread so that her grandchildren can eat. Mr. Bailiff, collect the fines and give them to the defendant." So the following day, the New York City newspaper reported that $47.50 was turned over to a bewildered old lady who had stolen a loaf of bread to feed her starving grandchildren. 50 cents of that amount being contributed by the red-faced grocery store owner, while some 70 petty criminals, people with traffic violations, and New York City policemen, each of whom had just paid 50 cents for the privilege of doing so, gave the mayor a standing ovation. What an abundance of life for everyone present in that courtroom. When we walk in the ways of God and practice the love of Christ in all of our affairs, public and private, we embody the life of God here in this world. And it's infectious and contagious. No one is left unaffected. But each day we must choose. And the right choice means life in a home. And not just for us as God's people, but for the outsider as well. And the right choice means economic practices that save us from being strangled by our own greed and leave enough for everyone. The right choice means abundant life personally and communally. Today we have set before us life and death, blessings and curses. May we all have the courage to choose life, that it may go well for us and all those around us. Amen.